sound like a good idea from where I'm standing. I have to say,
sure it does
I'm not quite sure what else we can do.
The morning briefing was supposed to be a routine gathering of senior advisors, quietly managed and carefully controlled. But in one silent instant, the document on the table changed everything. King Charles had signed Princess Anne's name into a role Britain had not seen granted in living memory, and the entire palace felt it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. A regency is not a title the British monarchy distributes lightly. To understand what Charles had done and why the decision sent a current of shock through every corridor of the palace, it is necessary to understand what the word actually means. A regent is a person appointed to govern in place of a monarch, to carry the full weight of royal authority when the sovereign is unable to exercise it personally. It is, in constitutional terms, one of the most significant designations the crown can bestow. It is not ceremonial. It is not honorary. It is real power, transferred by deliberate act to a specific individual deemed capable of bearing it. Britain had not seen such a designation made under these circumstances in generations. The last time the machinery of regency had been seriously engaged, the country had been navigating a different kind of crisis entirely. The fact that Charles was now activating it, quietly, without public announcement, through a document signed in the presence of only his most senior legal and constitutional advisors, said something about the moment the monarchy was inhabiting. Something the palace had not yet found the language to say publicly. The decision had not come without preparation. Nothing of this magnitude arrives without a trail of smaller decisions that precede it, without conversations held in rooms that official calendars do not record, without the kind of institutional groundwork that large organizations lay before they move in directions they cannot easily reverse. Charles had been building toward this moment for weeks, and the people closest to him had understood the direction of travel even when the destination remained unconfirmed. What no one had fully anticipated was the name. Anne, not William, whose constitutional position as heir made him the obvious candidate in the minds of most observers who had considered the question theoretically. Not a committee of senior counselors operating collectively. Not any of the arrangements that historical precedent might have suggested as the most straightforward path. Anne, the Princess Royal, the monarch's only sister. The woman who had spent more decades in service to the crown than almost anyone currently active within the institution. The woman who had made a career out of being the family's most reliable presence precisely because she asked for nothing, expected nothing, and delivered everything with a consistency that had come to seem unremarkable simply because it had never once failed. Charles had looked at his institution, looked at the moment it was facing, looked at the people available to him, and chosen his sister. The room where the document had been signed was small. That detail mattered. Large rooms in the palace are for occasions the institution wants to be seen performing. Small rooms are for decisions it needs to actually make. The constitutional advisors present had been sworn to discretion of the highest order, and the legal witnesses who had confirmed the signing had been drawn from a circle so tight that its existence was itself a form of security. But institutions, however carefully managed, have walls that information passes through. And by the time the morning briefing concluded, the decision that Charles had made in that small room had begun its quiet, inevitable journey outward. William learned of it before the public announcement. That had been Charles's explicit requirement, that his son be informed personally, directly, and with enough context to understand the reasoning before the institutional language of official communications flattened the decision into something manageable and bloodless. The conversation between father and son took place in the private sitting room at the end of the corridor that Charles used for meetings he did not want staffed. No aides, no advisors, no one whose professional obligation was to the institution rather than to the people inside it. Charles spoke first, which was characteristic. He had always been a man who prepared his words before difficult conversations, who arrived with the architecture of what he needed to say already built, so that emotion could not dismantle the structure before the essential thing had been communicated. He told William that the decision had not been made lightly. He told him that the constitutional framework for regency had been reviewed in its entirety, that every alternative arrangement had been considered seriously, and that the conclusion reached after that review was the one now recorded in the signed document. He told him that Anne had been chosen not as a slight to William, not as a bypassing of the heir, but as a recognition of something the institution required in this particular moment that Anne was uniquely positioned to provide. The kind of authority that does not need to perform itself. The kind of steadiness that had been built not through preparation for power, but through decades of service that had never once been contingent on reward. William listened with the careful attention he brought to information that required processing before responding. He did not interrupt. He did not react visibly in any way that Charles could have read as either acceptance or resistance. He simply listened, in the way that people listen when they understand that the full meaning of what they are hearing will take longer than the conversation itself to arrive. When Charles finished, William was quiet for a moment. Then he asked one question. He asked whether Anne had been consulted before the decision was made or informed of it afterward. Charles said she had been consulted, that the conversation with Anne had preceded the signing by several days, and that Anne had accepted the designation with the same absence of ceremony she brought to all obligations. William received this. He nodded once. He said he understood. Charles looked at his son across the small room and saw something in his face that he recognized from a long way back. The expression of a person absorbing something they had not expected while simultaneously understanding, at some level below surprise, why it was right. He said he hoped William would come to see the decision the way he himself had arrived at it, not as a diminishment but as a foundation. The regency was not a permanent arrangement. It was a response to a specific set of circumstances. And within those circumstances, it was the most responsible thing the crown could do. William said he trusted his father's judgment. He said it in the tone of a man who meant it. Catherine learned of it from William in the private hours following his conversation with Charles. She received the information with the composed attentiveness she brought to all significant news. Listening fully, speaking only after the picture was complete, asking the questions that clarified rather than complicated. She asked William how he felt about it. He took his time answering. He said that his first reaction had been surprise, because the obvious answer to the question of who should hold the regency had always seemed to point toward him, and his mind had been organized around that assumption without him ever having consciously built the assumption there. It had simply accumulated, the way certain expectations accumulate inside institutions, through the absence of any information that contradicted them. But beneath the surprise, he said, there was something else, something that had arrived more slowly and felt more reliable. He said that when he thought about who inside the family was genuinely equipped to carry the authority of the regency, not in the constitutional sense, not in the sense of legal eligibility, but in the sense of having the kind of interior resources the role actually demanded, the answer that arrived was not himself. It was Anne. Catherine looked at him. She said she agreed. She said she had watched Anne operate inside the institution for long enough to understand what distinguished her from almost everyone else within it. The distinction was not one of intelligence or dedication, though both were present in abundance. The distinction was one of motivation. Anne performed royal duty without any visible relationship to what performing it produced for her personally. No accumulation of position, no management of perception, no calibration of output to outcome. Just the work, done with the consistency of someone for whom the work was its own complete justification. That quality, Catherine said, was exactly what a regency required. Because a regency placed a person in a position where the temptation to use authority for personal purposes was present at every moment. The only reliable protection against that temptation was a character that had no particular interest in power for its own sake. Anne had that character. She had spent a lifetime demonstrating it in conditions where demonstrating it required no demonstration at all. William listened to this and said that Catherine had articulated something he had felt but hadn't yet found the language for. She said that was usually her job. He almost smiled. The public announcement arrived through official channels with the measured formality the palace applied to significant constitutional communications. It was not sensational in its language. It did not reach for drama. It stated what had been decided, identified the relevant legal framework under which the decision had been made, and provided a brief account of the circumstances that had made the designation appropriate. Britain read it and felt the ground shift. Not dramatically. Not in the way that obvious crises produce immediate reactions, but in the slower, more significant way that genuine institutional changes move through public consciousness, with a delay that reflects the time required for people to understand not just what has happened, but what it means. The first responses came from the expected quarters. Constitutional experts, royal commentators, parliamentary figures with opinions on the relationship between the monarchy and the mechanisms of governance. The analysis was thorough, occasionally contradictory, and almost universally focused on the question of precedent, what had been done before, what this choice signaled about what might come next, what the selection of Anne over William revealed about Charles's thinking and the palace's assessment of the current moment. That last question was the one that traveled furthest. because the choice of Anne over William was the part of the announcement that most people had not anticipated and could not immediately explain using the frameworks they already possessed. The frameworks they possessed were built around the logic of succession. The heir receives authority. The institution protects the line. Power flows through the established constitutional channel, not around it. Charles had not flowed through the established channel. He had moved beside it, with deliberate intention and full legal authority, and placed the designation in hands that the constitutional channel had not identified as the obvious recipient. The public needed to understand why. And in the absence of the palace's full reasoning, which the official statement had gestured toward without fully exposing, people began constructing their own understanding from the materials available to them. Those materials included everything the public already knew about Anne. And what the public knew about Anne, accumulated across decades of watching her operate inside the institution from a position of remarkable consistency, was actually quite a lot. They knew she had never sought the spotlight. They knew she had always worked harder and said less than almost anyone in comparable proximity to the crown. They knew she had been the family member most consistently present at difficult moments, not performing presence, not using difficulty as an opportunity for visibility, but simply being there in the way that people are there when they have decided that being there is the obligation and nothing more is required. They knew she had a quality that the public, without using the word, had always recognized as integrity. The particular integrity of someone whose behavior did not change depending on who was watching. And they knew, though this knowledge was less formal, more atmospheric, that when things inside the palace went wrong in the specific way that institutions go wrong when their human elements are under pressure, Anne was the one who moved toward the problem rather than away from it. The Regency, seen through this lens, began to make a kind of sense that the constitutional analysis had not quite captured. It was not simply a legal designation. It was an expression of trust placed in a specific character by a monarch who had spent a lifetime watching characters operate under pressure and had reached a conclusion about which one he needed beside him when the weight of the crown became something that required distribution. Anne received the public response to her designation with the expression she brought to all public responses. No expression at all, in the specific sense that her face declined to perform reaction for the benefit of observers. She continued her schedule. She fulfilled her obligations. She appeared where she was required to appear and conducted herself with the same exactness she had brought to every public appearance across decades of service. But in private, in the small spaces where the institution's most honest conversations took place, she allowed herself something closer to the full weight of what had been placed on her. She spoke with Charles once more after the announcement, in the same kind of small room where the document had been signed. The conversation was brief. Anne's conversations were always brief when the essential thing could be said without elaboration. She told him she understood what he had given her and what he was asking her to hold. He told her he had never doubted her capacity for either. She told him that doubt would have been reasonable, that the scope of what the Regency represented was not something she had carried before, and that she was not in the habit of assuming competence in unfamiliar territory. He said that her awareness of the scope was precisely what made her the right choice. That the people who were most dangerous in positions of significant authority were the ones who did not feel the weight of it, and that Anne had always felt the weight of everything she was given without allowing the weight to change how she moved. She looked at him for a moment in the way she had looked at him across a lifetime of rooms like this one, with the particular directness of someone who had decided long ago that honesty was the only form of loyalty worth offering. She said she would not let the crown down. He said he knew. The days following the announcement produced the kind of public conversation that significant royal decisions always generated. Sustained, wide-ranging, frequently emotional, and grounded in the particular relationship Britain maintained with its monarchy, which was never entirely rational and never entirely sentimental but always deeply felt. Supporters of the decision argued that Charles had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment a monarch was supposed to exercise. Not defaulting to the obvious, not allowing constitutional convention to substitute for considered assessment, but looking at the specific demands of the specific moment and identifying the specific person most equipped to meet them. They argued that choosing Anne was not a departure from the values of the institution, but an expression of them. That the institution had always claimed to value service above self-interest, duty above ambition, consistency above performance. And that Anne was the most complete embodiment of those values currently available within the family. Those who questioned the decision did so primarily on constitutional grounds, arguing that bypassing the heir in favor of a collateral family member. however well qualified, set a precedent that complicated the logic of succession in ways that could create difficulties further down the line. Some added a more personal dimension, suggesting that the decision reflected tensions within the family that the official announcement had not acknowledged, and that any full understanding of the choice required accounting for. Neither camp was entirely wrong. Both were missing something. What they were missing was the simplest part of the explanation, the part that palace statements never quite managed to convey because institutional language was not built to carry it. Charles had chosen Anne because he trusted her, not with the hedged, qualified trust that one institution extends to another institution. With the direct, unmediated trust of a person who had watched someone operate across a lifetime of circumstances and had arrived at a certainty that was beyond the reach of argument. He trusted her with the crown the way you trusted someone with the thing that mattered most to you. Not because you had run the calculations and arrived at a probability, but because you had watched them and you knew. William's public statement regarding the designation was brief, gracious, and entirely consistent with the private position he had reached in his conversation with Charles. He expressed his full support for the decision, his confidence in his aunt's capacity to fulfill the role, and his understanding of the reasoning that had produced it. He said nothing that required decoding. He meant what he said. The palace communications team had expected a more complicated response to manage. They had prepared language for various contingencies, including ones in which William's reaction required careful framing. The statement he actually released made most of that preparation unnecessary. Catherine said nothing publicly. Her silence was not absence. It was the specific choice of a woman who understood that some things were more powerfully communicated by not requiring communication. Her support for the decision was visible in the support she provided to William during the days that followed, and to Anne during the formal occasions at which their paths crossed in the new configuration of authority the Regency had produced. To Anne, in one of those moments, she said something brief and private that the two women would not discuss publicly. Anne received it with the small nod she used when words were sufficient and additional response would have diluted them. The first formal occasion at which Anne exercised her designated authority was quiet, procedural, and attended only by those whose presence was constitutionally required. There was no ceremony. There was no public event designed to mark the moment visually for audiences or cameras. There was a room, a set of documents, a legal process, and a woman who had spent a lifetime preparing for exactly this kind of responsibility by pretending she was doing nothing of the kind. She moved through the occasion with the efficiency she brought to all obligations. She asked the questions that needed asking. She reviewed what needed reviewing. She signed what needed signing. She thanked the people present and departed with the same unhurried directness with which she had arrived. Those present would later describe the experience in similar terms, though they would describe it to different people in different contexts. They would say that it had not felt like witnessing power being exercised. It had felt like watching someone do their job. And the reason that was remarkable was not that the job was ordinary. The reason it was remarkable was that the job was the most significant one available in the institution, and in Anne's hands, it had the quality of something completely natural, as though authority of this kind had always been where it belonged, and the only unusual thing about the morning was that it had taken this long for everyone else to notice. Britain absorbed the Regency with the gradual settling that the country brought to all significant royal developments. The initial noise of debate and commentary found its level. The analysis moved from urgent to considered. People returned to their lives with a particular adjustment in background, understanding that large institutional changes produce not a transformation of daily reality, but a subtle recalibration of the frame within which daily reality occurred. The monarchy continued. Its events took place. Its obligations were met. Its public presence maintained the combination of accessibility and mystery that had sustained its relationship with the British public across centuries of change. But inside the palace, and inside the constitutional architecture that the palace inhabited, something had shifted in a way that everyone present could feel and no official document fully captured. The shift was this. The institution had demonstrated that it was capable of seeing past its own most deeply embedded assumptions when the moment required it. It had looked at the obvious answer, the heir, the direct line, the path of least institutional resistance, and it had chosen something different. Not because the obvious answer was wrong in any absolute sense, but because the specific demands of the specific moment called for something the obvious answer could not provide. It had chosen character over convention. It had chosen demonstrated reliability over presumed entitlement. It had chosen a person who had spent a lifetime earning trust without seeking it over a person who would have received authority as a matter of constitutional logic. And in making that choice, the institution had said something about itself that no statement from its communications team could have said as clearly. It had said that it understood the difference between the two things, that it still had the capacity to tell them apart, that somewhere within the machinery of tradition and protocol and accumulated habit, there was still a judgment alive enough to recognize what the moment actually needed. Anne had not asked for the regency. She had not positioned herself for it, had not allowed others to position her for it, had not done any of the things that people inside institutions do when they want to advance toward a designated role. She had simply done her work, year after year, with the consistency of someone for whom the work was its own complete reason. And the work had brought her, in the end, to the most significant designation the crown could offer. Not because she had reached for it, because she had never needed to. Charles sat alone in the small room after the formal process had concluded. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet after they have held something significant. Not empty, but settled, as though the walls had absorbed the weight of what had passed and were holding it with care. He thought about his sister. He thought about the decades he had watched her operate inside the institution they had both been born into. The institution neither of them had chosen, the institution that had shaped them both in ways they understood only partially, the institution that demanded everything, and offered in return something that could not be named simply, but that both of them, in their different ways, had learned to value. He thought about the decision he had made, and the reasons behind it, the reasons the official statement had gestured toward, and the reasons it had not touched, because institutional language had no vocabulary for them. He had chosen Anne because she was ready. Not ready in the sense of having prepared for the role, but ready in the deeper sense of being fully equal to it. The sense in which certain people are equal to whatever is placed before them, not because they have rehearsed for it, but because everything they have done across a lifetime has quietly made them so. He hoped Britain understood what it had been given. He believed, in the end, that it did. The monarchy survived because it occasionally remembered what it was for, not the ceremonies, not the protocol, not the accumulated tradition that filled its calendars and shaped its public image, but the people, the specific, irreplaceable people who gave the institution its actual content, who filled its forms with something real, who carried its obligations not because they had been told to, but because they understood, in some place below reason, that carrying them was necessary. Anne was one of those people. She had always been one of those people. And now, with the signed doc, thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.